Tell me, are you sick of seeing life become an endless cycle of working and eating and sleeping? Are you sick of being injected time and time again with addictions ranging from social media to video games to pornography, one after another relentlessly being thrown your way? Maybe you've only now begun to realize that the world you're seeing is merely a world that was pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth, to stay obedient, to just be another cog in the machine. But you might recall a faint feeling you felt at some point inside of you, a fire you barely felt lighting up, a desire for glory, conquest, and greatness, the feeling that you would rather die on your feet than live on your knees, to remember the two greatest blessings in your life, the day you were born and the day you found out why. And yet that fire in you has become so faint that you ask yourself why? Who is it that's trying to put that fire out, and why are they so hell-bent on doing so? These were the emotions felt by hundreds of thousands of young men across the world as 𝗟𝗡𝗧'𝗦 would release a series of videos exposing the modern dystopia. Needless to say, those videos went viral, and though they would disappear just days later, the sentiments and clarity these young men claimed they had gotten still remained stronger than ever, that they have the cure to the social diseases of society, that the digital renaissance is well on its way. But I beg to differ. Have you ever seen the man that is poisoned, and as he sees the deadly effect spread throughout his body, he tries to cure it by drinking more poison? Surely you'd think this person has gone mad. Well, what then do we make of the person that is so deeply disturbed by the oppression of these puppet masters, yet tries to cure this corruption by recreating the very source that caused it? The Renaissance. That's where the laws of modern society were created, with all of its loopholes, lies, and room for back-end deals with no accountability. Yet, there was scientific progress, no doubt, but not because of critically thinking individuals that broke free from the puppet masters. Oh no, there's history that's been hidden from you. The explanation of history 𝗟𝗡𝗧 presented is known as the classical narrative, that after a brilliant period of math and science during the Greek era, there was a period of stagnation until the Europeans picked up where the Greeks left off and built upon it, with little happening in the 1,000 years in between, a dark period of no progress. And the reason for this period of no progress is religion, the iron fist of the church that would subjugate its population for over a millennium. Therefore, scientific progress necessitates the removal of religion from power, separation of church and state. And that's exactly what birthed the Renaissance. Yet at the same time, on the other side of the globe, we have the Islamic world proving the exact opposite. That a society with no religious authority suffers from weakness, and that with the creation of an Islamic state with its own set of divine laws is what takes a small group of illiterate tribal Arabs and turns them into one of the most powerful forces in history, creating a society that has at some point in time cured itself almost completely of poverty, crime, degeneracy, drugs, and the list goes on. That scientific progress is slowed and stunted without religion ruling society to inspire the masses towards rational thinking and fulfillment. And I can't help but think that it isn't by pure chance that we're taught the classical narrative at school, or that it was just by chance that the ideology that has been the victim of the largest smear campaigns and propaganda in our times just so happens to be the same ideology that brought justice when none was to be found. They say, if you want to see who has power in society, look at who you're not allowed to criticize. But often we don't hear the other side of the coin. If you want to see what those in power are most afraid of, look to who's being criticized the most. And as you take a look at what it is the puppet masters are trying so hard to bury into the deepest corners of history, there is one and only one victim you find: Islam. The countless propaganda projects released by major social media companies showing violence and war in Muslim countries while emphasizing this is a country that doesn't give women the right to education, opinion, or even to leave the house without a body bag covering them, trying to show that Islam destroys countries and civilizations. It's a barbaric system that's built for oppression and control. You have large corporations like RAND implementing their books such as Civil Democratic Islam, a literal blueprint on brainwashing Muslims worldwide and keeping them war-ridden. You open the world map to see these beautiful large land masses only to realize a certain part of it is being so war-ridden and broken up into fractured states you can barely recognize it, which coincidentally just so happens to be Muslim majority states. Why? Why are these puppet masters so hell-bent on repressing this ideology? Why do our curriculums never teach us what really happened during the Dark Ages, what really started the Renaissance, just what secrets are buried under their lies? And by the end of this video, you'll not only know the answers to these questions, but you'll know exactly how to dig humankind out of the deep hole it's dug itself into. Now, I have to give credit. Iman explains how the puppet masters stayed in control during the Dark Ages quite efficiently and how we're living in dark times right now. But the blunder is when he begins to explain how Europe was saved from the Dark Ages, which led to a false conclusion on how to save humanity going forward. Sure, people had to slave away their entire lives with little to no pay, living in disease and poverty, while the oppressive tax rates were justified by the elite saying God commanded it. It's in the Bible after all. And since people were largely illiterate, they couldn't reject it or they would burn in hell for eternity. It was absolutely clear that the people in power were using religion to indoctrinate the masses and keep them under control, whilst preventing any rebellion or revolution. But Iman goes on to claim that the Dark Ages came to an end when men broke free from mass control and began thinking for themselves. But that's simply untrue. The progress and inventions that were made throughout the Renaissance period were a result of the puppet masters, starting a movement we know as the mass translation movement of Arabic to Latin. Not simply because men broke free from mass control and began thinking for themselves, no. Because whilst Europe was going through some of its worst times, the Islamic world was going through some of its best. And centuries of scientific progress began to trickle into Europe. So you can thank these puppet masters for sparking a blooming relationship between the Islamic world and Europe during the 8th century in the Iberian Peninsula. Two of the biggest civilizations began to interact in this small place. And the first mass translation efforts would be done in 1136 in the Cathedral of Toledo by the Archbishop of Toledo, 𝗟𝗓𝗡 de 𝗟𝗧'𝗦. Again, someone from the upper echelon of society, a puppet master. The focus at first was to start learning science from the ancient Greeks such as Aristotle and Plato. But the problem is almost all of these books were preserved in Arabic except a few Greek manuscripts. So the demand for Arabic to Latin translators was through the roof. And over a century later, in 1256, a monk named Hermanus Alemanus hit the jackpot. One of the first complete translation of Aristotle's text, along with the commentary of a certain Muslim scholar known as Ibn Rushd. This translation echoed through the corners of Europe and it inspired rational thinking like no other. Movements such as Averroism began to start preaching this, and soon enough it was identified by the very people that started this translation movement. The Church. The Bishop of Paris issued a condemnation against the thoughts in 1270, and the Pope himself would condemn it in 1277. In other words, the puppet masters saw Ibn Rushd's works promoting rational thinking as a threat, something to be stopped. These were the early tensions that began to arise between the scholars of Europe and the rulers, and the focus had shifted from the ancient Greek works to now uncovering the genius they began to see in the Islamic works. And this is where the Renaissance actually kicks in. Nicholas Copernicus, nicknamed the father of scientific revolution. One of his greatest works, the heliocentric model of the universe, just so happens to be an almost exact replica of the heliocentric diagram of 𝗟𝗧'𝗦, an Islamic scientist that existed almost 300 years prior. 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦 lemma was a theorem used by Copernicus for his models of upper planets, which was considered groundbreaking, and yet Muslim scientist Ibn al-Shatir used it already to unify all planetary models to a geocentric format almost 200 years prior. These are some of many reasons why scientific historians conclude that Copernicus must have studied earlier Islamic texts. There is no room for coincidence with such evidence. And even the scientific method that you've learned about in school that apparently was created by Galileo Galilei was already in effect over 500 years prior throughout the Muslim world. The best example being Ibn al-Haytham, the person that would discover how light and optics functioned centuries before Isaac Newton would, and would even end up creating a prototype camera that only existed as a theory before him. Teaching this history is what you would call a recipe for revolution, which is why they have literal corporations, organizations, and books dedicated to suppressing this history, like I mentioned earlier. That's why this history is quote-unquote dangerous and shouldn't be taught ever. Instead, we should label the centuries before the Renaissance as Dark Ages, where nothing really happened. Therefore, researching this period of history is pointless and would lead you to find nothing but death and destruction. Interesting how that works. And one of the worst effects of the classical narrative is that it teaches people that if you want to revive a society, it will take you 600 years to do so, just like it took 600 years to go from the Dark Ages to the Enlightenment period. And if you ever want a revolution, then remember what I taught you at school. Every single revolution you learned about in school was a bloody battle between the civilians and the state. You want a revolution, you say? A renaissance? Well, go ahead. and sign up for mass bloodshed while you're at it, just like those before you, and stay hopeless in your efforts for change while you stay chained under our laws. But don't you dare try to study the only revolution in history that succeeded without a single drop of blood being shed. And you would think that it would take you more than 600 years for such change? Try 13. A revolution becoming successful in a mere 13 years is breathtaking on its own, but without a single drop of blood being spilt? Surely this is fictional, but you must understand. As the church would condemn people from aspiring to become rich because it leads to temptation and sin, Islam would do the exact opposite. It advocated for every single Muslim to have the entire world within their hands, and yet their heart should only desire the pleasure of God. In fact, the Prophet, peace be upon him, told us who the best of us really are. And it isn't the most powerful, nor is it the richest, and it isn't even the smartest of us. He said the best of you are those that are most beneficial to humanity. The best Muslim is the one that pushes humanity itself to new heights, unheard of, to break past the limits, to never settle for mediocrity. Even poverty in an Islamic state is haram, but no Islamic state exists today, therefore widespread poverty exists. The Renaissance period would like you to believe it takes 600 years to revive a society, and yet the Prophet, peace be upon him, did it in a mere 13 years. That too starting from a place that is lower and darker than the place we call from today. He too was cancelled for preaching a revolution against the puppet masters of Quraysh in Arabia. He too would endure slander and propaganda campaigns against him. He too would endure boycotts, sanctions that stripped him and most of his followers of the most basic necessities of life, to the point he would be unable to sleep at night from the crying of children, hungry and thirsty, and the hard-hitting reality that the love of his life is starving to death day by day within his own arms, and his beloved daughter that he loves so much is developing a permanent stomach disease from eating and drinking things no human ever should. And you know what the worst part of all of this is? That the puppet masters repeatedly told him that all of this suffering is his fault. That he came with this call to revolution. That if he hadn't been such a loudmouth calling for political change, his loved ones wouldn't have to go through such severe suffering. And yet, he persevered. He understood psychology, history, and politics better than any literate scholar in human history. He understood what it takes to make this revolution successful. So even when faced with the highest levels of cancellation one can think of, he never raised a finger against the puppet masters. To him, the dream of a bloodless revolution coming true was imminent. And a year after the boycott had ended, he was able to migrate to a city called 𝗟𝗘𝗧, where he sent one of his students to preach the message a year prior, during the boycott. It was a success. The population accepted the message of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and they made him their sole authority, their one and only leader. This exact moment is where the Islamic calendar started. Year 0, day 1. What he left behind for us in those 13 years is a step-by-step guide on how to recreate this revolution. And if I were to break it down, this video would surpass 2 hours easily, which is why I'll dedicate a separate video to it entirely. So, 𝗖𝗎, you can either continue your trial and error approach until you find out what works and what doesn't work, while causing destruction at every little step and every little mistake, eventually leading to a bloody revolution like every other, or you can use the same system that brought humanity progress, while maintaining social cohesion and keeping family structures without shedding a single drop of blood and curing every social disease all at the same time. The final front to the puppet masters, the only one that stood the test of time. The Islamic system is the only antidote to degeneracy. And just as it saved the West from its dark ages and brought forth the Renaissance, it can bring us out of the darkness of our times. So, 𝗖𝗎, what alternate system are you calling for? Now, the goal of this video isn't to arouse suspicion on 𝗖𝗎 as a person, because I don't think he's intentionally trying to mislead anyone. You see, this classical narrative of history was so carefully crafted and injected into society to keep people running around in circles, unable to find a solution to their suffering. And unfortunately, it seeped into 𝗖𝗎's research as well, where he would do a brilliant job exposing the elites and showing the whole world the crisis of our time and the absolute importance of people gaining financial independence so they don't become economically enslaved to these puppet masters. But he didn't present any alternate system to replace the current one. In other words, he didn't have a real solution for society. Just more fingers being pointed, more cries being heard, and just a few more individuals who freed themselves of the economic clutches of the puppet masters. And I'm sure you're finishing this video with a lot more questions than when you started. Such as, if the Islamic world was so advanced and powerful, why did they fall? Or if the Islamic system is the only solution, why don't we see any of the Islamic countries today thriving and being on top? And to that, I say let your curiosity drive you towards seeking the truth. And of course, I'll leave the answers in the description below.